Hello, I'm Henry Mack, and welcome to this month's Viewpoint. In 2014, the Pew Research Center published a comprehensive survey on the U.S. religious landscape. The results showed an interesting trend in recent years, namely a growing number of American adults no longer identify with a religious group. Defined as atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated, these quote-unquote nones, N-O-N-E-S, now account for approximately 23% of the U.S. adult population. But recently, researchers went back to 5,000 of those surveyed to get direct answers for why they left religion behind. And so joining me now to discuss this shift in the U.S. religious landscape, we welcome Elsie Miranda, Associate Professor of Practical Theology and Director of Ministerial Formation at Barry University, and Alfredo Garcia, Adjunct Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami and Adjunct Professor at Florida International University. Alfredo is finishing his PhD in Sociology at Princeton University. Thanks for taking the time. I don't know quite where to begin, but maybe, because there's so much here really, we have the reasons for why people are sort of leaving organized religion itself, specifically Christianity in America. We have the decline of the Christian influence, and we can see that politically and with respect to certain policies as well. So Alfredo, let's start with you, and maybe you can provide your analysis of this trend.
Now, I'm quite skeptical about all this type of data that's coming out, because our reigning theories about why individuals in the United States have been leaving religion behind has a lot to do with the confluence of religion and politics in the United States. So we have the evidence of the 1960s and the countercultural revolution, the opposite conservative backlash that took place in the 1980s, and then finally the dropout of mainly white mainline Protestants who dropped out of their faith and went into this new nuns category. So to hear that there's a tremendous decline of white Christian America really surprises me and makes me ask the question, what else is there? For me, it has a lot to do with demographics, and it has a lot to do with demographic change. Because if you look at the numbers and you break them down, the vast majority of these individuals are in the 18 to 29-year-old bracket. We're talking about older and younger millennials. And so my question, usually when I look at this type of data, is what makes the social situation now for younger millennials different than the social situation for the older individuals in the United States?
Which is then accounting for the quote-unquote decline.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And what's your analysis of that? What's the difference?
I mean, it's vast. And I know that we are very quick to jump on the anti-millennial bandwagon. We love to trash on the millennials. And maybe it's because I'm a millennial that I don't like that. But part of it is that millennials are the most geographically mobile generation that we've seen in recent American history. Second, we marry later. Third, we have less children. And when we do have children, we have them later in life. Now, sociologically, all those steps in the life process are always connected to increasing levels of religiosity. So it's very difficult to join a church, for instance, when you're moving around a lot, when you're deraciinated, when you're uprooted so much. Second, when you get married and when you have children, there's usually some kind of return to religiosity that's associated with that.
Interesting. Elsie, what do you think about that?
Well, I find it interesting that the more and more groups become independent and more self-reliant and economically stable, the less they perceive a need for sometimes religious communities, traditional religious communities, and part of the millennial dynamic, I think, is that they're finding community in a different kind of social media network. And so going to a place like a church to have or to experience that community seems to them a little bit passé. But at the same time, I do believe that religion is more about locating some sense of transcendence and understanding the world a little bit more symbolically. And so we haven't been adequately attending to those realities or even using that kind of language. And so I think a natural progression is that we're losing some of the the influence that we've had in how people understood life in general.
Yeah, so it's always been a problem of humanity and the human condition, wondering about our origins, our meaning, or whether or not meaning exists and where does it come from, right? And perhaps the reason, apart from the sociological analysis, is what you're saying, I guess, maybe is, right, millennial generations and those that are involved in this study are finding meaning elsewhere. For good or ill, I suppose, right, which is then causing an exodus from organized religion itself. You want to say something,
Yeah.
then I want to get to the actual reasons that they indicate for why they're now unaffiliated. But go ahead, real
There's
quick.
also a big question as to how the cultural air has changed so that it is possible today to be secular, right? And so when we ask ourselves about meaning and we ask ourselves about turning to different directions for meaning, it is possible today, and we call it the secular age, right? Howard Taylor's big book. And so there's an argument to be made that maybe it's more
Charles
acceptable. Yeah. And so it's more acceptable to be secular in today's age, which is something that we haven't seen in recent history.
Which is interesting. So let's come back to that. But I want to get to these reasons that the survey sort of picked up on for why people say now they're unaffiliated, right? So the first thing they said is that they just simply quite don't believe. They've learned things about evolution. Their trust in science is greater than that in religion itself. Too many Christians are doing unchristian things too. And secondly, too, we'll stop here after this one, a dislike of organized religion. They no longer believe in organized religion, the clergy sex abuse scandal within the Catholic Church and even Christian denominations too, and the social teachings of many churches are not jiving with the millennial perspective, not just millennials, but even, Generation Xers and those that preceded the millennials. So maybe let's, I don't know, try and talk about that. What about the trust issue, Elsie? You teach pastoral theology, which is applying the teachings of the church to everyday life.
Right.
So this is definitely within your wheelhouse.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Thanks for the lob.
Yeah.
So Johann Baptist Metz said that he asked the question, do you believe in God or do you believe in your belief in God? And I think some of the questions that have arisen for us in this, past 100 years is really what is undergirding some of these reasons why they don't believe in God. They don't trust. But many Christians have fallen to believing in their belief instead of believing in God. And really,
What does that mean?
that we've
by that?
made an idol oftentimes of our belief. And we've lost track of the basic Christian principles that that Jesus modeled and emulated throughout his life. And we can look at how Jesus's life, suffering, death, and resurrection, parallel the seasons which generations, thousands of years ago lived by. And so what has happened with the abuses of power in the last, let's just go back 100 years, but we could go back 500 years or more.
It's sort of always been an issue,
It's
really.
always been an issue, right? How we abuse power, and how now we have media that calls us on that almost instantaneously, leaves people with a far more intellectual capacity to critique the messenger and then do away with the message. And I think what we need to be about is reintegrating the message into our everyday practice.
Fair point. So if you're saying basically if people really understood the message, the content of what is believed, more than focusing on either the idolization of the religion itself or the detractors or those of us that do sin, one bad apple seems to spoil the bunch now. But I guess people aren't making that distinction in their minds, and that they're so sort of hurt by, quote, too many Christians doing unchristian things that they now no longer go to church because of that. It doesn't seem like their faith, arguably, was really that strong to begin with then.
Right, and we're living in iconoclastic moments
Yeah.
where the shattering is rampant.
Right.
Again, I'll be the skeptic. And so what I find interesting is that I think there's a disjoint between believing and belonging, as we talk about in sociology, right? So the fact that people are believing but no longer belonging and being a part of some kind of religious community, because it goes back to your question of power, who has the authority to determine what you believe? And you can see this also in the data about these nuns, because you can see that there's a whole host of them that still pray, still believe in a deity, still all these classic religious elements, yet self-identify as none of the above. So I think that a lot of it just has to do with a decline in belonging, which is not just associated to religion. It's all sorts of belonging.
All over the place. It was interesting. We did a panel last month on Viewpoint with a bunch of millennials asking them about religion. One of the biggest criticisms of religion was that it wasn't entertaining enough. They didn't feel a part of the community. They didn't feel as if they can contribute to anything really actually too, nor did they feel, they didn't feel valued.
Honestly, many people would say
But then,
it's their fault, it's religion's fault. A lot of people have stated that there is a whole segment of the population after they graduate from high school until they get married that are absent from the activities and patterns of religious communities across the United States.
But growing up in a Catholic household myself, I never really thought it was the responsibility of the church to make me feel welcomed, right? If I wasn't feeling something, that was on me. That wasn't on the religion itself, right? So how have we gotten to a point where the dynamic, or at least the burden of responsibility, has shifted here?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that we need to recognize that prayer and ritual and entering into a sacred space as a community is not so much about entertainment as much as it is about, really kind of moving into an interior space. And I think millennials in general and many other people outside of that category, we're living externally at such a fast pace that it takes us a long time to go inward. And so you've only got 45 minutes to entertain me, engage me, and I'm out.
And then
I don't think it's about entertainment, but it's also about invitation, right? And so I think that by somewhat ignoring, from the data that I've seen, a feeling of being ignored, of this, again, this 18 so it's not the church's responsibility, but it is the community's responsibility to welcome individuals of this.
Let's get back to the other reasons that was provided in this survey. Thirdly, it was quoted as they're quite just religiously unsure or undecided. They say, quote, "I'm leaning towards spirituality. I believe in a higher power. I know I can pray to my God anywhere, but I don't need an organized religion or church to do that." Right? We're sort of alluding to this already. And then lastly, though, too, they say they're an inactive believer. I don't have time for church. I stopped going when I went to college. And again, to this last point, which we'll address in a second, they believe more in science than in fiction, which is what religion is sort of reduced to, right? A byproduct of our emotional, imagination is what many now people are calling religion itself. But anyway, so let's talk about all of that.
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Where do you want to start?
I guess maybe let's start leaning towards spirituality. I believe in a higher power. I know I can pray, and this is a quote, "My God anywhere, but I don't need a church to do that."
Well, it's September, and I found this little pin at Trinity Church in New York City, right outside where the Twin Towers fell. And it's a reminder of the two pieces of structural beams that were left behind in the form of a cross when everything came down. And I found it fascinating that in a world where we want, North American culture trying to be post-Christian sometimes, we focused on this symbol and hung onto that as a sign of faith and hope. And it brought people together, and people, people started to bring all kinds of memoirs and mementos to this space, around that cross, and the cross was set apart. So I think sometimes we speak out of two sides of our mouth because we don't want to be religious, and at the same time, we need to find faith and hope in certain symbols that bring us together.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a part of, well, I may not belong to a church, but we used the cross as a national symbol of faith and hope after the Twin Towers fell because we needed something to pull us all together.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the general trend towards hyper-individualization is also at the heart of this kind of thinking. And so in our literature, we talk about Sheilaism, which is, Sheila was a character in one of these ethnographic books, Habits of the Heart, a qualitative study of Americans in the 1960s and 70s. And what we found is that there was a tremendous amount of people who said things like this. I believe in my own church. Sheilaism is what they called it, right? Because of Sheila saying, I believe in Sheilaism. And that trend of hyper-individualization is only continuing more and more. And so I asked the question, yes, I agree, we need some kind of solidifying symbols. But what are they? And I think at this point, we're lacking in that. And I don't think that people are going to be turning to religion just too soon to find those. I think people are searching, but they're not finding what they're looking for.
Sure. And with the decline, really, of Christianity, as these Pew Research articles allude to, in America, as well as an article in Atlantic recently, though, too, that was talking about this. With the decline of Christianity comes the decline of the accompanying social and moral beliefs, right? And I would contend, it's my submission, that America is becoming more politically and ethically liberal to such an extent that we shouldn't really want to sort of impose or confine people into one particular political or moral viewpoint rather than another. And religion tends to do that, right? Millennials and a lot of people don't want to be boxed into a community that dictates morality to them when morality has become a mere matter of subjective opinion.
Could it also be about identity? I think that we're pushing against all sorts of boxes, not just boxes about religious identity, but also, for instance, in the census, now we can select more than one ethnicity or more than one race at the same time. And so I think it has to do a lot with identity because of the fact that there's certain types of stigmas and identity formations that are attached to the boxes that we already have.
Yeah, interesting. Elsie, how do you square that point of identity and really individualism and my point about moral relativism with Catholicism's recent sort of, crackdown on moral relativism itself? How do you square the peg?
That one's a far more complicated question.
I know.
And I don't know that there's an answer.
This is the only show on TV that talks about it, though, so we have to.
Right, but I think that we need to struggle more and more with the questions that emerge from that question.
Yeah.
And, there is a need for moral values in society. We need to understand that we have moral and ethical responsibilities to one another. Freedom is not.
But you can find those outside the church.
Right. But the church is a way. Church provides communities with a moral compass. And when you have children, when families find themselves with little ones and they want to impart some sense of ethical framework and a really a formative narrative, then they tend to find that religion as an organized system has something to offer.
But then religion is purely utilitarian then. It's not really for the sake of what is believed, but again, as a means to just inculcate values.
Well, but I do believe...
then it becomes just,
Well, but I do believe that it's a good place to sow seed.
True.
And that as you get older, you need to find a way that you either fit into that system or you need to grow up and emerge from those, kind of formative years and be perhaps more pragmatic and more engaged in the work that you need to do to live that faith.
So in an attempt to really try to figure out how to address this, Albert Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention Seminary, was quoted as saying that most, quote, mainline denominations have been losing members by the thousands for decades. He continues, many of these churches become so theologically inclusive, politically liberal, and doctrinally confused that there is no compelling reason anymore for anyone to join anyway. End quote. So should churches entrench themselves and become more conservative and more dogmatic in an attempt to sort of like regroup here?
Well, I think it goes back to this question of identity.
That quote came from this article that I referred to earlier in the Atlantic last month.
And I think identity, however you have young men and women joining sororities these days because it gives them an identity within the context of a college campus. And religion gives people identity, and you belong. You're an insider and an outsider, and people want to have that sense of belonging, as you said, and how we find it, I think, depends upon our own particular needs. You know, we can look at the God gene and you know, the hypothesis is that, you know, people want to believe and are hardwired for believing in something. And so if we align ourselves with people who are commonly linked to believing in something in a very particular way, you know, you establish communities. And I think religion in its traditional form will make a comeback if we respond to the needs of communities to have, you know, to toe a line. You know, we don't have to toe a line with a hammer, but there is a sense of this is who we are, and if you want, you know, we welcome you. But we can today. There's a sense of needing to welcome with an approach of both and not either or. You know, in the sense that you don't have to. You know, like there are more and more churches accepting, you know, for example, gay and lesbian couples because they recognize that they were always part of the community. Now we're just acknowledging that you were always part of the community, and we welcome you.
Yeah.
On one level, good fences make for good neighbors, right? But on the other level, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, because we find, for instance, that evangelical Christians have been decreasing just as much as mainline Protestants have been decreasing. And in fact, their percentage drop is greater than the mainline Protestant drop.
Yeah.
The other thing we notice is that the Catholic Church as well has been in decline, but the numbers stay steady in the United States because Hispanics have been replacing the white Anglo-Catholics who've been leaving the church. So I don't buy that argument either. I don't buy that strong fences are going to make for stronger communities, because I agree with you. I actually find that today we're more accepting of the Buddhist Catholic, for instance, or the Catholic who meditates, or we're more inclusive of other types of doctrinal and, you know, spiritual practices than we once were. But I think, again, it goes to the root of our kind of existential reality of today that is in opposition to boxes, and more importantly, to the powers that construct those very boxes that we seem to have to play with. And so I think a lot of it, at the root of it, has to do with power, not necessarily doctrinal conservatism.
Okay, thanks for the segue. Speaking of power, and I always wanted to touch on this at the beginning of the show too, only because I'm a philosopher, and, you know, full disclosure with you, I teach at the University of Miami, and I'm teaching a problem of God course right now, right?
Yep.
And we're debating about the relationship of faith and reason, and whether or not science is compatible with religion, or science in the traditional empirical sense is compatible with theology. And one of the reasons why people now no longer believe, as cited in this Pew study, is that evolution has proven to be true, and that somehow discredits the possibility of real belief in God. Or, you know, the God particle has been discovered, right? And we have an answer for why there is something rather than nothing at all. And there's no need to believe in God because science has sort of demonstrated things as non-falsifiable. Whatever. I don't mean to get too heady, but the point is that people are believing in science and the power of science more than religion, and then religion is taking a backseat. I wanted just your analysis on the compatibility or the incompatibility of science and religion. Let's go to you first, actually, because I'm just interested to see what you say, since you're not the theology teacher.
Right. So
here.
this is you're pushing me into the boundaries where I don't normally, you know, traverse.
Yeah. Well, you shouldn't as a sociologist,
Right.
but I'm just asking you to for fun.
No, this is fun, because the thing is, for me, it has to do with epistemological authority.
Yeah.
And so I think that people turn to different sources of knowing the world. And we have many different sources of knowing the world. And so spirituality is one of them, science is another one, but also our day-to-day existence is full of different ways of pursuing what is. And unfortunately, I believe that there's no incompatibility between science and religion.
So there is compatibility.
I think that there is, yeah. And I think that what it is that these are all pursuits towards truth, that as we find more and more, we need like...
I was hoping to box you into the strictly scientism perspective where you were going to say that science is the only source of knowledge.
No, but here's the thing is that I cannot ignore the data that time and again shows that people have this issue of incompatibility. And so Elaine Uckland, for instance, has this massive study of scientists and their religious beliefs. And time and again she finds that the further you go into the sciences, or the further you go into the hard sciences, the less religious you are. And the more they explain things exactly as you were detailing, that science is just incompatible with any kind of religious faith.
Elsie, closing thoughts.
So I'd like to quote Einstein, who said that everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man. And I don't believe that science and religion are incompatible. I don't believe that religious texts, for example, Genesis, should be read literally. Evolutionary theory is a scientific reality, and I think that religion can, easily inculcate itself into that scientific narrative in a way that gives people meaning and proposes, an ethical
I guess the
paradigm.
trick is in the way in which it does so. It has to do it in a way that doesn't make it just subjective. Like void of any significance or void of any meaning, merely because it's just the personal opinion of whoever's believing. I don't know what I'm trying to say right now.
I don't, I'm not a big proponent of, my personal Lord and Savior kind of mentality about God. God is, whatever God is, God is. And
Okay.
how we the multitude of ways that we connect with that sense of divinity, is, I think there is power there that we need to recognize and be humbled by.
Right. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I would really, really hope that the viewers take this to Facebook and social media. Would love to engage with the both of you too, and the viewers in the near future on this topic. Thanks for taking the time.
This
Right.
has been awesome. Thank you.
You can comment, as I said, on today's program on our Facebook page, which is Viewpoint with Henry Mack, and join us for another episode of Viewpoint next month on Sunday, October 2nd and October 16th at 12:30 p.m. right here on WPVT2. I'm Henry Mack. Thanks so much for watching. Formation at Barry University, and Alfredo Garcia, adjunct professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami and adjunct professor at Florida International University. Alfredo is finishing his PhD in sociology at Princeton University. Thanks for taking the time. I don't know quite where to begin, but maybe because there's so much here, really. We have the reasons for why people are sort of leaving organized religion itself, specifically Christianity in America. We have the decline of the Christian influence, and we can see that politically and with respect to certain policies as well. So, Alfredo, let's start with you, and maybe you can provide your analysis of this trend.
Now, I'm quite skeptical about all this type of data that's coming out because our reigning theories about why individuals in the United States have been leaving religion behind has a lot to do with the confluence of religion and politics in the United States. So we have the evidence of the 1960s and the countercultural revolution, the opposite conservative backlash that took place in the 1980s, and then finally the dropout of mainly white mainline Protestants who dropped out of their faith and went into this new nuns category. So to hear that there's a tremendous decline of white Christian America really surprises me and makes me ask the question, what else is there? For me, it has a lot to do with demographics, and it has a lot to do with demographic change. Because if you look at the numbers and you break them down, the vast majority of these individuals are in the 18 to 29-year-old bracket. We're talking about older and younger millennials. And so my question, usually when I look at this type of data, is what makes the social situation now for younger millennials different than the social situation for the older individuals in the United States?
Which is then accounting for the quote-unquote decline.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And what's your analysis of that? What's the difference?
I mean, it's vast. And I know that we are very quick to jump on the anti-millennial bandwagon. We love to trash on the millennials. And maybe it's because I'm a millennial that I don't like that. But part of it is that millennials are the most geographically mobile generation that we've seen in recent American history. Second, we marry later. Third, we have less children. And when we do have children, we have them later in life. Now, sociologically, all those steps in the life process are always connected to increasing levels of religiosity. So it's very difficult to join a church, for instance, when you're moving around a lot, when you're de-resident, when you're uprooted so much. Second, when you get married and when you have children, there's usually some kind of return to
Hello, I'm Henry Mack, and welcome to this month's Viewpoint. In 2014, the Pew Research Center published a comprehensive survey on the U.S. religious landscape. The results showed an interesting trend in recent years, namely a growing number of American adults no longer identify with a religious group. Defined as atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated, these quote-unquote nones, N-O-N-E-S, now account for approximately 23% of the U.S. adult population. But recently, researchers went back to 5,000 of those surveyed to get direct answers for why they left religion behind. And so joining me now to discuss this shift in the U.S. religious landscape, we welcome Elsie Miranda, Associate Professor of Practical Theology and Director of Ministerial
Religiosity that's associated with that.
Interesting. Elsie, what do you think about that?
Well, I find it interesting that the more and more groups become independent and more self-reliant and economically stable, the less they perceive a need for sometimes religious communities, traditional religious communities, and part of the millennial dynamic, I think, is that they're finding community in a different kind of social media network. And so going to a place like a church to have or to experience that community seems to them a little bit passé. But at the same time, I do believe that religion is more about locating some sense